All right, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Amada Cruz, the Ilse Ball Nordstrom Director and CEO of the Seattle Art Museum. I want to welcome all of you to tonight's virtual conversations with curators and artists. Very excited about tonight's event. Michael, thank you so much for joining us and speaking with us this evening. Show us your incredible work and speaking also about your activism, which in these days is particularly important. Before we start, I think it's important that we acknowledge the painful time that we are all going through as a country and as a city. Sam's mission is to connect art to life. We have social justice and racial equity as our value statement on our website. It's something that we are very committed to. We certainly stand in support of all of those seeking justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. We share in their grief, their anger, their frustration, that their friends, their families, and Black communities are certainly experiencing and feeling. We are committed to doing our part in the necessary and very important work in creating racial equity. Thank you all. And now I'd like to introduce Tiffany Tasada, who is SAM's membership director and the host for tonight's event. Tiffany?
Great, thank you, Amada. And good evening, everyone. I'm Tiffany Tasada, Director of Membership and Annual Giving. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the Seattle Art Museum is located on the homelands of the Duwamish people and the traditional territories of the Suquamish and Muckleshoot peoples. We further acknowledge that many urban Indigenous people who call Seattle home. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second live installment of Sam's Conversations with Curators lecture series. Thank you for joining us tonight. And most importantly, thank you for your support as members of the Seattle Art Museum. This evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from Barbara Brotherton, Sam's Curator of Native American Art, who will be in conversation with Nicoll Yahgulanaas. They will discuss his work, Carpe Fin, a large-scale piece that refreshes an ancient Haida tale in an innovative hybrid style, incorporating pop art, Japanese manga, and Northwest Coast Indigenous formline art. This work was recently commissioned by Sam, and funding for the installation was made possible by the McCrae Foundation. Barbara joined Sam in 2001, coming to us from Western Michigan University, where she was an associate professor of art history. She received her PhD in art history from the University of Washington and has extensively studied the Salish language and culture. For the past 20 years, Barbara has been a member of the Lushootseed Research, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation of Native language and oral traditions. And in her time at SAM, Barbara has curated many stunning exhibitions, including Double Exposure, Edward S. Curtis, Marianne Nicholson, Tracy Rector, Will Wilson, and You Are an Indigenous Land, Places, Displaces. She has also served as the local curator for the last year's wonderful exhibition, Jeffrey Gibson, Like a Hammer, and Indigenous Beauty, Masterworks of American Indian Art from the Diker Collection. In addition, we are so fortunate and thankful to have the opportunity to hear from the artist himself. Nicoll Yahgulanaas is joining us tonight to discuss his work with Barbara. But before we begin, I want to just briefly share with you the format for tonight's presentation. During the presentation, all audience members will be muted. Barbara and Michael will speak for approximately 30 minutes and will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A. To ask a question, please look for the Q&A button on your screen. Feel free to send your questions over at any time during the presentation, and we will try to answer as many of those as we can. And lastly, we are recording this, and it will be made available to members in approximately a week or so. And now I'm happy to introduce Barbara Brotherton and Nicoll Yahgulanaas.
I'm working on a piece right now, which I think the work you're going to see in the webinar is going to be previous works. Obviously, this work is obviously being created right now. And so it kind of represents a little bit of a leading edge and perhaps a departure from some of the narrative work that we'll be looking at earlier, particularly with Carpe Fin, which is narrative driven, both as as a book, and as a mural, it's a bit of a challenge. We'll talk about that. But on a piece like this, I take the panel and have finished the back. And what I've got here is I've got documents from 1922, financial documents from a company based in Vancouver. And then I've layered this panel with old maps as well. So I'm really enjoying collage these days. So there's many, many layers here. And I'm putting this sort of Haida Manga craziness. I'll be the first to admit this, kind of just a little bit nutty on top of it. In the background here, I have my brush temple, which is, there's a couple of brushes there that are just too precious, and I haven't worked up the nerve to use them. So kind of crazy. And then some smaller, a lot of Asian brushes, some Western brushes as well. And then down here in the table, I think you can see it, I've got a small watercolor kit. I think those are Holbeins. And then over here, I don't know if you can see that, but the box of pencil crayons as well. And so I'm mushing together a lot of different materials. One of the reasons why I can feel so liberated to do that is I don't have any formal art instruction in terms of a Western or an institutional practice. So I don't know if there are people on here who are better informed than I, who are probably saying, no, don't mix these things together. And so there's a certain arrogance, I think, or a, what's the saying that, fools will tread where angels dare not go. So there's a lot of that goes on. Where we're in right now is my COVID studio. It's pulled together for the last couple of months so I can do some work. And because I can't get into my main studio, which is in West Vancouver, Canada. And I think we'll see an image of that studio a little bit later. So it's a bit of a jumble, but I'd be dishonest if I say that my studios are ever very clean. I don't know if we can do question and answers, if this would be appropriate, but if somebody wanted to, as I understood, somebody did wave their hands a little earlier with a question.
I think we could take some questions now. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's try that.
I'm happy to continue muttering away here in the absence of any questions. This is a dry studio. In that, I mean, I do works on in metal, the coppers from the Hood series, which again we'll see in a few minutes, which are being well received, I'd have to say. The Denver Art Museum most recently, previously the Metropolitan in New York, the British Museum, some of these major heavyweight institutions. That work is done elsewhere, and actually in what I would call a wet studio, where there's I'm using materials that I don't want to infringe on the dry studio.
Yeah, so I think some of the questions here.
Okay.
What is the raven in the corner?
Raven in the corner of what?
Looked like there was.
I'm not sure if the reference is to the work I'm doing, but in the background, let's just work with that. That's a paper cast of a beaver, actually. And I took it off my cousin's totem pole, Idinsu, Jim Hart, years ago, and he was about to take the name Idinsu, which is a pretty high-ranking name in our family and in their community, in our nation. And so I decided to do a whole bunch of paper casts, just using brown paper bags and copper wire to hold up the edges, and flour and water, and created a series of puppets. We called them big things because the largest one was 14 foot high, and you could get inside and manipulate it, and it could dance around in the hall. And that was so well received. It was heartwarming to see how it worked. with the community. And I think in part, it really captured the enthusiasm of a living community as opposed to the sort of static monumental work that we're typical, we typically associate with Haida, totem poles and the like. And those are gorgeous statements. The difference, I think, between a pole that is in an institution or a collection that is static is the poem is written down. That's the text form, and you need to interpret it. I think the great puppets, of which this is the only one still in existence, this is the spoken poetry. And it has that vibrancy and immediacy, and it's responsive to the audience. So the question was, what is the raven in the corner? And I still don't know what corner we're talking about. So I've been talking about the beaver in the background.
Michael?
Yes, Tiffany.
We have some other questions. So could you talk a little about what prompted your interest in Manga?
Yeah. You know, I have to confess, I'm not, well, I'll try and get right to the answer. I tend to sort of be like a dog wandering around. I've got to hit every telephone pole. I'll try and focus here. You know, the relationship between people of color, indigenous peoples specifically, and Western culture, the United States and Canada, has been really problematic and continues to be very, very difficult in many respects, very violent and assaultive for the last couple of 100 years. In the turn of the early 1900s and the late 1800s, there was an industry at work in the North Pacific. It was a sealing, pelagic fur seals. And the vessels often employed, and I think went out of their way to employ, indigenous hunters who were adept at being at high sea in small vessels, hand-powered vessels, canoes and rowboats, skiffs, if you will, and also able to hunt in these conditions. And one such vessel leaving Victoria, BC, went up to Masset, and on that ship, a couple of my relatives went and spent about 9 months at sea, traveling from Haida to Hawaii to Yokohama, and then up into the waters between Korea and Japan, and then following the pelagic seals south of the Aleutian Islands and back, and that was the circuit. One of the things that persisted in my life were the stories of how welcoming Japan was, and Korea, how warm, and how men from Masset felt that they could walk the streets as a full human being. They could go into a shop. They could be treated like a human, compared to what it was like here in the Americas, in the continent. Why even in the community of Prince Rupert, there's one cafe called Smiles Cafe, and I always like to give a little shout out to them because unlike every other restaurant in Rupert, Prince Rupert, it was open to indigenous people. The restaurants and cafes in Prince Rupert had signs saying no dogs and no Indians. So it was within this kind of terrible racist environment that Japan existed as this shining opportunity to be a full human being and not to be judged on one's complexion. And so when I started to examine how do you translate Haida classic design into a populist art form, I wanted to respect this Asian tradition of graphic design, but also to speak specifically to that warm relationship between Asia and indigenous people in this part of the world.
Okay, Michael, I think we have Barbara now on the audio here, so you should be able to hear Barbara. Are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
That's great. Michael, I don't think you need me.
Oh, no, I do. Oh, no. Come
Okay.
back. Come hither.
Here we are. I do want to give a little bit of background about Michael, but I'll make it brief since I think he probably communicated a lot about who he is. He's an amazing artist. He's very creative. He loves his materials and does a lot of research with his materials. He loves drawing. He has captured the essence of Haida traditional or classic art and just pushed it into the future in this beautiful new idiom that he calls Haida Manga. And you're seeing a version of it here, a very large version of it here. His career just keeps taking off, and he's doing incredible things, including working with the Vancouver Opera, who are staging an opera that is an operetta that is based on his book and work, The Flight of the Hummingbird. And that's something that we might be able to see here in Seattle. But he keeps creating and going in new directions, has really made a space for viewers to approach his art in very innovative ways. So I think you'll see that in the slides. The process of Carpe Fin coming about was a very interesting one. And it's always an exciting time when a museum can work with an artist on a major commission. And this was and is one of the largest commissions that the Seattle Art Museum has done. And it's certainly the most significant one in the Indigenous collection, although it operates very fluidly between all the collections in the museum, the Native American collection, the contemporary and modern collection. But interestingly enough, the powers that be came together in the universe, and when Michael was ready to take on such a monumental project, we also had donors step forward. And I'm very grateful to Jill Davis of the McRae Foundation and also to Karen Jones for giving us the support to bring this to fruition. So, Michael, I think you remember our first discussion about creating Carpe Fin. And I was surprised to hear that in actuality, you had started working on this long time ago in 2001. And through the magic of your creativity, 17 years later, the same brush that made those early sketches completed this monumental work in 2018.
Mm-hmm. Yes, 2018. Took about 18 months of actual brush work, but as you point out, it was more or less 18 years in the oven, I suppose.
So one of the points of departure was that we both greatly admired a wonderful work in the Seattle Art Museum that was carved around 1870 by Michael's ancestor, Albert Edward Edenshaw. A beautiful headdress frontlet that shows that a particular story that Michael has also captured for Carpe Fin. It was an old Haida, part of an old Haida oral tradition that was written down by an anthropologist in 1901. And these are some of the elements that went into making this work. And you can see a kind of vestige of that red figure that's been transported from the frontlet, and we'll see that in a minute, to the Haida Manga. Do you want to talk a little bit about, let's go to that slide. Can you advance to, what do you think, Michael?
Well, I love it. Pause and enjoy the exquisite carving. It's not a very large piece. It's just, but it's stunning. The many things that I like about it. I like that the figure sort of sits so comfortably on a chair, perhaps holding a skana orca on his lap. And I also like the way the treatment is on the forehead with those lovely pieces of abalone and how it falls back. And I used this central figure in Carpe Fin, which is also a book. I don't know if this is a book here, but in the center, I've played with that red face. There's the black eyebrows, and made it the sort of central piece of the mural. And it's interesting that in the text, which is not in the mural, but it's in the book, I've written, "Your grandfather calls you in." And in a way, that's kind of a personal conversation that I'm having with the gentleman on to the immediate, in the black and white photograph, the gentleman, Albert Edward Edenshaw, or Edinsu, who is an ancestor of mine. And there's an example of his very fine artistic style. And I want to reach back and connect with that, but like he was doing at that time, where he is creating work that speaks to him in a powerful way. The work that I'm creating today is not to try and replicate what he was doing, but to try to speak to the contemporary moment that I and all of us are living in right now. And that's why the transition from that beautiful frontlet to a mural and to a book, I think the power of that piece there is the time that Edinsu lived in, and hopefully the mural is a similar commentary that is for the moment, and audiences can look at that. If you look at the mural in its full size, I think of it as a translation piece, as a bit of a guide. There's a narrative behind this frontlit piece. I have observed how people who don't know Haida culture, and I would maybe say maybe indigenate even, but particularly Haida culture, approach large pieces of work, and this sort of sense of reverence comes on, and it's good to have that sense. But we also have to understand that this piece of work that we're looking at was made by a living human, who, like all of us, is imperfect and celebrates life in different ways. And the mural is an effort to try and leave spaces for the observer to become emotionally engaged in the work without having to know the narrative, but trusting and enjoying the sort of visual buffet that's presented in the mural. So seeing this piece at the Seattle Art Museum, it's a real treat to be able to see these things, and not just the distance of living in Haida Gwaii or even in Canada, or just not going to the Seattle Art Museum. You can only see images of this, but when you get to see the actual piece, I hope you take the same delight that I have in the way the curators have set the piece up, so that the frontlet is sitting intimate to you on a post in a container, sort of in the center of the room, and then behind it is the mural, so that you can sort of see the two and be a judge yourself to see whether or not there is a conversation taking place between Albert Edward and myself. And it is a conversation that includes you when you step in to make those, to have that experience.
Thank you, Michael. Can we go to the next slide? So you just spoke about the relevance of Albert Edwards' work for his own time, and thinking about your own time, when after 150 years of colonial assault upon the Haida people, the protests that came up in the 70s and sort of culminated in the Lyle Island blockade in 1985, and your very strong participation in that. What was at stake for the Haida people there at that time? And how has that real deep sense of environmental stewardship become indexed in all of your work?
So in 1985, or perhaps just a little bit earlier, the Haida government, which is the Council of the Haida Nation, and its legislating assembly, the House of Assembly, passed a law that prohibited logging in certain part of the archipelago, which is now called Guayahanas. And the reason for that declaration at that time was, I think, a sense of exhaustion that Haidas had observing the impacts of industrial scale logging on the landscape and the marine environment even. It's difficult to explain the impact that removing all the plant cover, all the timber has on the soil in the high earthquake and high precipitation areas such as the temperate rainforest is. And so bear in mind also the temperate rainforest is the most threatened rainforest on the planet. So logging at that industrial scale really took off in the early 60s, and although it started much earlier, but it was the scale, it was the rapidity, I suppose, of the removal of all this timber that was, people just became exhausted and had attempted for 14 years immediately previous to 1985 to have a conversation with the province, the provincial government about let's find a different way through. And a gentleman's agreement, if there's such a thing, had put a line on the landscape and said no logging past this area. And in 1985, the province approved logging. Interestingly, the men who made the decision to approve the logging were also shareholders, members of cabinet, the Minister of Forests at the time. They were actually shareholders in the logging company that got the permit. So I mean, it was just clear that we were dealing with people who were not honorable, and so the law was passed. So what you see here in this picture, these photographs here are community members stepping forward to enforce the law. Yes, it is a protest, but it's more an assertion of a pre-existing authority on the landscape. And it's what happens, I think, when people just can't take it anymore. And so that really informs the work I'm doing in this way. It's the power of the small. The Guayahanas area today has been identified by National Geographic Society as the best managed protected area in all of North America. And that's because after we stopped the logging, we didn't say, okay, everybody go home and this is just us. We offered to Canada to set up an entirely different management system, which wasn't based on the imposition of one party on the other, but it required that all management decisions be made by the consensus of the Canadian government and the Haida government. And that just changes the dynamics entirely. The relationship is collaborative and cooperative. Not to say there isn't arguments, it's certainly not perfect, but it's much better than saying I have all the votes and to heck with you, which leads to violence and nasty behavior. So realizing that there was this place that we could come together, this tertiary space between the oppositional forces, that there was possible to have, a new kind of relationship if you went right. Anyways, so I decided to take the classic design form and to create a Haida Manga as a vehicle to try and give people ability to see behind the tropes and the sort of static images and imaginary Indian histories that are so prevalent in both the United States and Canada, so people could see us as living people. Thinking that if we see one another as living people, maybe we'll stop doing the horrible things that are being done to the other.
Let's look at the next slide. You created numerous political drawings with humor, satire, compassion. for newsletters, grassroots publications, flyers, and posters. What were your objectives in creating this visual language to express these concerns?
Well, this work all primarily from the 80s, but spilling over in more recently in the early 2002. Those works were conversations within the community. Mutants of the Pit was a response to one of the more significant deposits of cinnabar, of mercury, organic mercury that moves through the food chain with disastrous results. It's also called Minamata disease, and it's in grassy narrows in Canada, back east, as a result of industrial pulp mill processes. That concept, that idea was an idea was proposed to mine mercury to extract some of the gold that was in association with that deposit, and it was right alongside the Yahgulanaas River, which is one of the prominent streams in this part of the world. Mutants of the Pit resulted from numerous conversations and research with geologists and biologists, with scientists, some in the United States, some here in Canada, to actually talk about what are the impacts of organic mercury bioaccumulation. And I took that jargon and translated it into the comic book format so that the community could better understand what the risks were. So this work was all, internal. We were trying to figure out and understand exactly what we were up to. The Mutants of the Pit, and then the editorial cartoon in the middle, which was in Spruce Roots magazine, used more of a Western format, square panels floating with vacuous gutters between the panels. The piece on the right, 2002, I start to incorporate Haida iconography as panels. To still play the same role of time and space dividers, but to make it just a bit more friendly. And in that process, started to discover a real serious problem with this idea of the empty space, of the gutter, these little rectangular, or these spaces between the rectangular panels. And I wondered, and still do, if the gutters that we see in Western comic books actually reflect an idea that is everything outside the experience that I am having right now in my little moment, my little cartoon panel. The separation between what I'm doing and what I'm going to do over there, or in a few minutes in the other panel, is actually unimportant. It's empty. And this sort of goes along with that old story of the terra nullius, which is the land is empty, as European colonizers came over here and just imagined that all these people were here were really worthless and had nothing to contribute to anybody except get them out of the way so we can get the land. So it's this sense that my story is all that's important and nothing else matters. And so we have these empty spaces. The piece on the far right, where you start to see Haida iconography, and says, no, the space outside my own experience is neither empty nor unimportant. It actually defines who I am, and it defines my relationship to myself and to other participants in the narrative, separated by time and space. We are linked together through this whole entire matrix, and you'll see that in Carpe Fin. So that's this really good capture of photographs from my vantage point. Is you really have captured a moment of transition in these images.
So, Michael, if we move ahead to the next slide, we're really seeing a sea change, a major shift in your work from the cartooning that you did in the service of environmentalism to a very sophisticated, full-blown art practice. How was it that you made that shift?
Well, I think, I have to acknowledge the role of institutions here. The Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver tapped me on the shoulder and said, would I like to do an intervention? And The intervention is depicted in the image with the Bill Reed's canoe upside down on top of a Pontiac Firefly. There were a number of other works, including the first ever copper shields, coppers from the hood, of which 2 of them were created. And I think they're in the Glenbow collection in Alberta right now. Now, during all these dark times I talked about earlier, when I answered the question about why Haida Manga, you know, most hands were against Indigenous peoples, and the exception to that, I would say, were institutions. My experience is, in opinion, is that to a significant degree, collecting museums and anthropologists were a different type of relationship. There was a lot of taking, you know, a lot of robbing of graves and removal of cultural material, but it felt like there was more interest in who we were as living people than there were in people who said, just get the hell out of the way so I can take your land and take your trees and take your fish and throw you into prisoners of war camps or whatever. So there was, if an Indigenous person came into the city, all these institutions, governmental institutions and corporate structures were out there in sort of predatorial relationship. And the exception were collecting museums. And I imagine that the Seattle Art Museum was part of that as well. There was more of an appetite and a willingness to have conversations and a different kind of relationship. So they were like sanctuaries. And I think that when the Museum of Anthropology tapped me on the shoulder and said, do you want to do something essentially bigger? They said, you know, we'll get some financing together and there, come into the space and play with it. That allowed me to land, I guess, on a platform away from my small village and away from the archipelago, away from Haida Gwaii and into the city, and have a place where I felt relatively safe and able to sort of just express something new and different. And it was wandering through that building and observing the objects such as Bill's canoe and the great sort of concrete spaces that were there that welcomed me to move outside of paper, that sort of intimate place that I am fully sovereign over because, you know, it has borders and I can do whatever I want within that 2D space. Suddenly, I was filled with the opportunity to do something bigger. And when you get that kind of an invitation, you either accept it or you don't. And I accepted it and just threw myself into it. And these are the results of that exploration. You know, perhaps at another time, Barbara, or we can go a little deeper. There's some lovely little backstories to why the Pontiac Firefly, why the canoe that way, and also to the hoods. But essentially,
yes, let's make a meeting to do that. So if we go on quickly, I guess this aroused my interest, this pair of slides. Because these works seem to show new explorations in terms of color, sequence, large scale. But I was also caught by what seemed to be the different impulses between private work and public work. Can you just briefly comment on this?
The private work is the piece at the top. The 4 panels, acrylic, a little bit of mixed media on canvas, and if you look at it, let's look at the first panel to the far left. That's actually a small R and an E, and the panel next to it is an M and an E, and next to it is an M and a B, and the last one on the right is an E and an R, and it spells out remember. And this is a story of my great-grandmother, Dolores Churchill's mother, Selena Paratovich is her name, a very influential person in my life, and I think just in terms of many lives, because she continued to practice art at a time when not many people were doing it, in terms of weaving and the harvest and the preparation of all the materials required to make these exquisite objects. And that is one of her stories, a personal story that she had shared with the family. And what I was trying to do there was trying to figure out, how do you take these designs, which are extremely sophisticated, but it's like, how do you break the code? Like, how do you interpret the hieroglyphics? Like, what does the glyph mean to somebody who doesn't understand? And so I was playing with that and trying to, see if it would work. So that was kind of a sketchbook for me. The piece at the bottom on the right-hand side is at the Vancouver International Airport. And it is a large, I think it's about 12.5-ton piece. It's in the MacArthur Glen Mall designer outlet. And I see the two are quite similar because of the shape of that piece, size. It's called, it's made of stainless steel with copper leaf. And I think it's not dissimilar to the small R's in the private piece. But the public piece was, it needs to serve a different purpose. It's not just the artist off in the studio, but it's how does the work actually serve the interests of the other? And if we can figure that out, if we can figure out how we live our life that helps other people out, or how we create work that speaks to other people's needs, as opposed to projecting our own, I think that the chances of success, of a successful integration in society and with other people's is higher. And in this case, Sai, today, yoga classes gather under it in the morning. There's been orchestras have practiced underneath it on a hot day. If you've got the shelter of this great steel piece hanging over top. So yeah, I'll just stop there. Again, we could
thank you. I would like to just say that some of the images in this presentation are in a very important book about Michael's work called The Seriousness of Play by Nicoll Yahgulanaas. And that was part of, that was a catalog for an exhibition that Michael had. So that's a really good source if you want to learn more about Michael's work. So here we have the doodle of the day. Michael, should we show it?
Yes, they're pretty brief.
There we go. So I know there are a lot of layers to the creation of Carpe Fin. Essentially, it is an act of drawing, and I see that you are enamored with drawing, with the expression, the act of drawing. How does it activate you to come up with your concepts and your narratives? The physical expression of drawing.
I find it extremely responsive. There was a time in my life when I was doing a lot of traveling for about 10 years, just working with an organization in the United States. And so I designed an entire mobile studio that could work on the little tray and the airplanes. And in the course of, let's say, an 11-hour flight, I could do a whole lot of stuff. The responsiveness and the intimacy of the tool, it's right here in my hand, and the paper's right there, and it's immediate. And it's direct. And so because of that, it becomes less filtered. You know, if I'm doing a big piece, let's say if I'm working a piece in steel, like we saw the Sai, there's months of design work, of computer-assisted drawing, of engineering calculations and fabrication. But they're huge. And so what they do is they create little layers of between that creative moment and the final expression. And I'm selfish. I want to do it now, and I want to enjoy it now. And so for me, drawing allows me to be right there. It also that immediately limits my ability to calibrate and calculate what it is I'm doing, so that I feel that I become more of a transitional device. I become a tool myself and don't judge so much these ideas. And I think Hayao Miyazaki's, the great artist from Japan, talks about his ideas. He says, you just throw a fishing line in my brain and let's see what we pull up. And I think the act of drawing allows for a whole lot of fishing. And I think it's that's the primary attraction for me.
All right, I think we're going to move ahead to Carpe Fin. Here we are, here.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So, Michael, can you talk just briefly about the process of constructing this very monumental mural? Some of the challenges and some of the blessings?
Well, technically, we see in the image here notebooks and sketchbooks. I tried to do a script. I did a script. Did I follow it entirely? No. The little wooden sketchbook at the top is actually a cedar sketchbook that I bought in Japan, harvested from a mountain, Koyasan, I think it was called. It's like 1600 temples, and it was all very lovely to be able to pick up these sketchbooks. And so then I'm starting to work the ideas out in this little sketchbook I can hold in my hand and very quickly sort of capture those ideas. And then the third piece, which is the larger, is still in the same photograph, the larger piece you see with the 3-ring binders, was a sketchbook that I built to then try and take some of the ideas I'm having, create a framing device, a frame line based on sort of Haida classic design, and then start dropping the characters in. And I did that for all 108 pages at that scale, on a 1-to-1 scale to the final mural. The daily doodle we saw earlier is another layer which isn't really represented here. On the right-hand side, you see the full-size sheet of paper that I then had everything scanned and then printed out again. So I probably redid the mural, well, at least 3 times before the one that you have in your collection. The framing.
I think we can go to that in the next slide, the one we have in our collection. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
There we go. So 6 very large sheets of specially purveyed paper from Japan, using your connections and friendships with traditional paper-making families in Japan, specially researched pigments to make them stable for a long museum display, and then just the grit of executing these drawings. I think this is the largest mural you've done. Is that right, Michael?
Yes, there are 3 murals in existence. The smallest one, War of the Blink, is the private collection of Vancouver. Red Haida Manga is using feet. It's 15 feet long and probably about 4 feet high. And it's in the permanent collection of the Museum of Anthropology. And this is the largest on a kozowashi, paper made by the Kuboto family on the western part of Honshu, and supplied to me by the good people at Ozowashi in Tokyo. And the pigments, yes, they're from Golden Paints in upstate New York. I met with the chemists and we went through to really look at the quality of the pigments and their resilience to degradation and light. So we have these 1 by 2 meter sheets of paper, the kozowashi, mulberry paper, extremely strong, amazing paper. I've seen paper hundreds of years old, and you look at it and it looks like it's brand new. The challenge for the observer when you do get into the Seattle Art Museum, my challenge to you is locate the beginning of the story, and I'll tell you where it is. It's the upper left panel, and try to read the narrative all the way through. It's impossible. The power of the undulating lines, the compression, the expansion of the classic Haida frame line, it's irresistible. The eye cannot follow the narrative that we know is there, and so there's a certain sense of confusion. But I think you can just float into it and just enjoy it, roll with it, and then go to the book, and the book will give you a guide, a tour guide, if you will, to how the story can be read in that way. And I'm wanting the observers to understand that it's the same story, but it's how is it presented that either makes it accessible or or not in terms of finding the narrative. But regardless of how you look at it, there's still an adventure to be had.
Okay, let's very briefly, before we are able to take questions, look at some of the details here. I mean, the work really entices you to get closer and to engage with you, and obviously that's what we want people to do. But maybe you can just make a couple comments about what people are seeing here.
Okay, so you're seeing on the left-hand side two sheets of washi, 2 sheets of paper, 1 meter high and 2 meters wide. And then you're seeing a close-up of those sheets on the right-hand side. And you can get a sense of the detail that's in the mural. And again, there's no text here, so the eye is going to follow the flow, the rhythm, the visual rhythm. And it's in the book that you can sort of exercise a greater degree of sovereignty, because you can decide how you're going to read the story, what's the pacing. If you want, you can read it backwards. And each one of these pages, whoops, that's for an adult audience. Each one of these pages is captured inside the panel elements on the mural. So you can actually stand there with your book and track it through. I didn't want to put text in that mural. It would have taken me another 6 months of work. And there was a point of exhaustion simply because of the scale of this piece.
Well, I hope these details and looking at Carpe Fin will entice people to come and look at it and come again and look at it. I think now is a good time to stop and take some questions. I really appreciate the patience of the audience here. I like to say that technology is good only until it isn't. I know somebody else said that, but I'm feeling that today. Tiffany.
Yes, we have some great questions here. Let's start with Michael. How do you stay inspired to create, especially during this difficult time?
Well, yeah, good one. You know, I was talking to somebody today in Haida, probably today, 75–80% of the population are survivors of smallpox plagues. In my own family, we know the names of the 2 young girls who managed to escape the use of smallpox by the British colonists. So for us, epidemics are quite intimate. They're not. This is not a casual thing. They're the risks of extinction. Really, we came pretty close. We lost probably about 90% of our population. So with that in mind, we've taken it quite seriously, and we've hunkered down in our little house under the trees. I'm fortunate to have space that I could put in a garden, which I did. And so what I discovered was being able to nestle in with my family actually allowed me to appreciate who they are, who we are as a family, and not to be so busy running around doing this, doing that, and the other thing, and trying to sort of, you know, raise the resources to maintain the house, for example. And so I was forced into a pause, which was stop, breathe, and appreciate it. Now, we haven't had to deal, we are a bit at high risk for exposure because, notwithstanding that, I think we've been able to really enjoy this pause. So the inspiration is just slowing down and being a bit more thoughtful instead of dashing off in all directions at the same time. I like that. So I am inspired by just appreciating what I have.
Great. There were a couple of questions that are about your materials. Some people wanted to know about the difference between Asian and Western brushes. What paint do you prefer to work with? As well as what were the brushes you were using when you were doodling?
Oh, okay. The brushes that I was using during the daily doodles, which we'll get more of them out. They're there. They're on my Instagram account. I can't remember the name of my Instagram account. It might be Haida Manga or something. But these are plastic. Sorry, I do have some made out of bamboo, but they're all dried out right now. And the thing about the bamboo and these plastic ones is they have a chamber inside that's refillable, so that you can continue to use these brushes over and over again. The bristles are artificial bristles. Pentel has done a really good job of building a bristle that I think significantly challenges natural bristles. Not entirely, but so because I can refill it, I use these a lot. They will, last for years. So that's what I use in the daily doodles. And if you're an artist out there, I suggest maybe you just pick these up, $20 or so, and you get the little cartridges. But you can take a hypodermic needle and put your own pigments in, so you can change your colors. You can change the solution of the ink as you wish. Choice of I prefer watercolor, and I think that just becomes more. I've never gone to an art school successfully, and so I just had to kind of figure out what it was I could use, and watercolor was most accessible to me as a younger person, and so I just sort of stuck with it. And I find that it's actually a very liberating medium, because we're working in layers and layers of color, and building it up. I'm actually puzzled to hear from time to time people say that watercolor is very difficult, and I don't agree with that. I do use acrylic a little, and when I grow up, I'm going to try oil. I'm staggered by some of the paintings I saw in Berlin in the fall, European oil paintings. Just amazing, and so I want to try those. The lack of schooling, I think, has allowed me just to mix and play, and so I'm open to anything. I like my materials. I like to know my materials. I like to play with them. So no tight preferences, but a familiarity with watercolor that just allows me to pick up the pigments, got a little box here, and I've got little travel brushes that fold down, and there you go. That and the brush inside and the piece of paper, I got a studio and I'm set to go. So accessibility again. I just wonder if because I was working earlier on this piece here, I don't know if I need to talk too much more about it, but someone asked a question about if it was a part of a series, and yes, it is. It's called the Ledger series, in part a nod to the Plains, indigenous people from the Central Plains who, when they were imprisoned by the U.S. Military, were doing drawings on ledger paper. But also, I hope I say his name right, I'll reveal my ignorance, but Ferdinand Léger, his work in the Metropolitan Museum was another moment where the jaw drops and hits my knees. Some of his work. So I call these the Ledger series, and there'll be more of those coming out in the near future.
Great. In addition to that work that's in front of you, what other kind of projects are you working on right now?
About 2 years ago, I was approached by the Vancouver Opera Company and the Pacific Opera Victoria, based in Victoria, BC, and they commissioned me to to write a libretto based on a book that I had published in 2005, I think, Flight of the Hummingbird. And so I thought, yeah, well, that's pretty easy. I can write some libretto and give it to them, and I'll come back and check in on opening night. And I didn't realize really what I'd said yes to, which was costume design and set design and lots of conversations, and working with an excellent composer from Montreal, Maxime Goulet, stunning music that he has written. We have a 45-minute libretto, and just about a week or so ago, I think, the Frankfurt Opera, which is an international scale opera company in Frankfurt, Germany, has commissioned the translation of the libretto into German, because they intend to mount a production there. So there's been a lot of attention placed into that particular project. And I think, as Barbara said earlier, I'd love it to be in Seattle. Because Seattle and Vancouver, I mean, we're sister towns. We share a lot of similar characteristics, and it seems that would be the good place for it to go. I am also looking at a story that I started again 14 years ago, Clan Hat, and I'm starting to develop the script and the characters, resuming work on that, and hope to have that come out as a publication. These projects that take 18 months to 2 years, they're not so easy to embark on. I usually have to find partnerships to do this. Yeah, I'm staying busy, and my daughter's 17, so all the parents out there know that that can be an interesting time of life as well.
Well, Michael, we have one last question. What do you see with the future of First Nation art and its potential influence with an industry of development that we are seeing within any of their respective traditional territories?
Wow. I don't know if I'm just one guy, and so I don't know. I don't know what the future is. It's my hope that if we can, if I can continue to do the work to make Indigenous narratives, such as the one that's behind Carpe Fin, which is the story of the man who developed the first ever detachable spear, where the spearhead comes off and you have a toggle, and it's a more efficient killing tool. And it's a story about how that was greeted by the community. It wasn't particularly greeted well, let me say. People were aghast at why build this efficient killing device, and other people were jealous. Anyways, sorry, wandering off there. But if I can take some of these concepts that we have of the relationship that people have to the world around us, as I was talking earlier about the form lines, sort of notion of cosmology. How about that? If I can take Haida cosmology and present it in a way that people can understand it, and have, I think, again, an emotional link to it, and see that we are layered and complex humans like they are, that what happens is the violence that has happened, the violence that continues to happen, disappears. Because if we see the other as ourselves, how can we do damage to them? It's this demonizing the other, this polarization. The only thing that I can say that would be justification for that is planet Earth is bipolar. But it's this splitting apart, this good versus evil, this false separation of us and them it's killing us. And so does art, and can I contribute to art that actually bridges between those two gaps, that celebrates one fact about every single human on this planet, which is we are all hybrid. There is no exclusivity. There is no us and them. It's all us, rather. It's no me and them. It's all us. Our hybridity, our diversity needs to be celebrated, and that's what Haida Manga attempts to do.
Thank you so much, Michael. Barbara, do you have any final words?
I just wanted to say thank you to Michael. Thank you for sharing your conversation, your art, your great chocolates from Bowen Island. And I also want to thank all the viewers who tuned in today.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Conversations with Curators with Teresa Papanikolas, who is our Anne M. Barwick Curator of American Art on June 17th. And she will be talking about what is American art. So stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for your generous time. And wish I could get to all the questions, but perhaps another time or through my website, mny.ca, you can drop me a line and I will respond to you there.
Thank you, Michael. Good night, everyone.
Good night.